All right, everyone, welcome. It's my privilege to just briefly introduce Mr. Taylor Schroll here. Uh, I've actually never met Taylor in person. I had invited Taylor to come to help with the retreat that we were supposed to have at St. Joseph in Houston. He's based in Texas, Bryan, Texas. But because of the pandemic, it never worked out. But then after I got transferred, Taylor graciously agreed to help with kind of like an online session we did for the high school kids here in San Francisco. And the kids spoke very highly of that session. And so, we've kept in touch here and there, but he's a man who does a lot. He's, has this ministry called Forte Catholic. He's been involved in other ministries like Ablaze, but he's a podcaster, he's a speaker. And I reached out to Taylor, and this was a topic in particular that he felt very compelled to speak about. And I think it's something that is going to be very useful for us because, we realize that catechism can't be fully just lecture. There has to be some sort of engagement and discussion. And so Taylor, really happy to have you, and please go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Father. I'm happy to be here. I enjoyed being with the youth last time, and now we got the adults. So today's session really comes from experiences for me, both when I was a young person, like primarily in junior high and high school, and then now I've been working with junior high and high school kids primarily professionally for over a decade. And I know that a lot of people, excuse me, work with younger ages. I have a third grader, a first grader, and pre-K next year. So I've got the younger ones at home, and then I work with the older ones whenever I'm doing talks and stuff and campus ministry, that sort of thing at our schools and Catechists and that sort of thing. So really what this is about is I noticed that, like, as Father started saying, like a lot of catechesis that I received when I was a kid was almost 100% lecture. So like I would go pretty typically be in a classroom, and the teacher would talk, and if I'm being honest, a lot of times it wasn't the most engaging thing in the world, so I would go and like I would learn things because, like, whenever you're listening to a lecture, like you'll pick things up, but does it really sink in? Does it really start to affect your life and that sort of thing? So I started looking back, and as I got into Houston, I said Houston, I'm thinking about where it was, but as I got into high school, I started having like some of the more impactful things that I received were people of faith who were adults that would just have conversations with me, right? And a lot of times it would be around faith. So like my youth minister was highly impactful on me, and we would have conversations. I'd bring questions to him, and we would just have these discussions. And those are the times that really started to have an impact on me. And now when I started working in youth ministry, I would spend just hours and hours, preparing like my talk or the, like that sort of thing, like the large group discussion. And then, maybe Sunday, an hour or two before the youth night, I would be like, oh yeah, I need to have like questions for the small groups or for the discussion groups or that sort of thing. And I would just kind of, kind of scribble something out real quick. And that's what I thought was good enough. And what I started realizing over the years was that in my experience, it was where the discussions, the conversations were where things started to impact me a little bit more. And I was able to take what I was hearing in the teaching and start applying it to my life and ask follow-up questions and that sort of thing. So I'm like, why am I not providing this as the youth minister? So this really all comes to two things: how Jesus taught and like how God reveals himself. So if you look at the Old Testament first, how God revealed himself is he always revealed something and then waited for a response, right? So if you think about it, it's like God didn't, in the book of Genesis chapter 2, when Adam and Eve were there, he didn't give them like all of the Catholic Church's teachings. he gave them some very simple rules. Like, hey, you can do whatever you want, just don't eat from this tree, right? And then wait for the response. You think about, God just continued to reveal himself gradually throughout the Old Testament and always waited for a response. He didn't just keep revealing things over and over and over again. He waited for the people to respond. And, there's another example, like in the New Testament, Jesus didn't walk up to Peter when he first met him, or I guess his name wasn't Peter then, but he didn't walk up to Peter right when he met him and say like, hello, I'm Jesus, the Son of the living God, the Savior, and you're going to be the first pope. Like, that's not how he started the conversation. He was like, hey, you're fishing on this side, try on this side, right? Like, meeting where he is, gradually revealing himself to him, to where ultimately, you guys know the story, like he ends up becoming that first pope and realizing that Jesus was the Messiah. He says that when he's asked this question. So I find a lot of times that in ministry, we are revealing things about God, right? We're teaching the things, we're doing the catechesis, passing down the things that we have heard. And a lot of times we are doing very well with the content, but I think what can be helped is the method. Like, how are we not only getting our message across, but getting our message, God's message, across in a way that's going to sink in really well. So we're going to be talking a lot about questions. So as I heard somebody talking about this at a conference, and the way that he started was, he was like, think about like the most impactful things that you've heard Jesus say, like quotes from Jesus. And a lot of times it's, things from the Sermon on the Mount, which is like a lecture, right? But have you guys ever sat down and read the entire Sermon on the Mount in one sitting? It is shorter than all of Father's homilies have ever been. So it is, and that's nothing against Father. It's just more just like, it's kind of a mind-blowing thing, where the most famous sermon Jesus ever gave was, I've read it in like 5, 6, 7 minutes, right? And then if you think about how he interacted with his apostles after, he would get up and preach, and then after, he would sit around with his apostles and they would ask him questions and be like, hey, we didn't get that parable. Hey, we don't really understand what's going on here. And that's where Jesus would really start to break these things down. So Jesus would have used, or we know that he did, he used a lot of questions, like some of the most impactful questions that I can think of, like, who do you say that I am? Because people they're having this conversation. Oh, some people say that you're Elijah. Some people say you're John the Baptist. And then Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? And I find it fascinating that he doesn't just say who he is, right? Because he wants the people to respond. He knows who he is, but he wants the people listening to really grapple with it and figure it out, right? Which is the same thing that we want to do with the kids that we are working with, whether it's a second grader or a 10th grader or all the way in between. We're in that same position where we know the things about Jesus, we know the things about the church. We want to pass those down, and a lot of times we're so excited about it that we just want to like share all of it, right? We're like, even Jesus didn't just share the content all the time, right? He he invited people into the discussion. He invited people into the process. He asked 135 questions. Jesus did throughout the Gospels, which is fascinating to me. So for us, and I know, like, you're all across the country, you're working with different ages. So like, being able to modify this to your specific situation is going to be the task for you guys. But my favorite way to teach is kind of this like mini lecture and then questions, mini lecture and then questions. I saw it, some of you are in classrooms, some of you might be meeting in larger groups. However you're doing it, what I would like to get out of today's session is, how can we ask better questions, and how can we um, incorporate questions into what we're doing. So if we were sitting together, this image would be 100% impossible over Zoom. But if we were all sitting in a room together, typically I would take a beach ball and I would hit it up, right? And I'm standing at the front of the room. Y'all are all in the room. You hit it up and be like, hey, let's see how many times how many hits we can get to keep this up, right? So I hit it, you hit it back. Everybody's hitting it, and then all of a sudden, maybe after like 14, 15 hits, it gets back to me, right? That would be an example of the ideal conversation being had with youth ministry, or with I would say probably whenever they get to like 5th or 6th grade, right? And any younger, like kindergarten to 4th, 5th grade, it might be hard to have really deep and kind of managed conversations, but especially once they start getting close to 5th, 6th grade, it's like I have the answers. Like, yeah, I studied this stuff. You guys have studied this stuff. You've volunteered to share your knowledge. But even then, even if you are the most, I would hope you're the most knowledgeable person in the room. If you're with 3rd graders, you still want to be able to have the conversation naturally happen, where you are more the facilitator rather than the teacher, right? And that doesn't mean that you're not teaching. Like, Jesus was always the teacher, the good teacher. Like, these are some of the names that he was given, but that doesn't mean he was always the one that was talking. So that beach ball thing is like, okay, I asked the question, and then maybe Father says something, and then somebody else says something, and like I'm guiding the conversation. Like if we're having a conversation about the woman at the well, if after 2 people are talking, we're talking about TikTok, it's like, okay, like we need to bring it back in a little bit, right? So like you're still facilitating the conversation. So I'm going to get into this part now. Essentially, there are it's kind of like a funnel to where we are going. So when you go into your classroom, your meeting, however you are meeting, what is the goal? What is the objective for that session? And a lot of times, like books that that you're using for catechesis even have those objectives. They're like, hey, today, if we're talking about Jesus, we want people to know that he is the Son of God, second person of the Trinity, and whatever, right? What is the objective? And how do we how are we going to get there? So like obviously you're going to have your content, and a lot of that's provided for you. I think I talked to Father last time about you'll have some books and things that y'all are going through and working through. But there's really 2 options, right? If you're meeting, I'm just giving an example. If you're going to meet for an hour, you could do 2 primary ways. Talk for a portion and then do discussion for a portion. Or you could do like talk for a portion, talk questions, talk questions, talk questions, talk questions. There's 2 options. And then if you're, with the kids, younger kids, obviously it's a little bit harder, but there's these 3 kind of questions that are going to funnel. There's the first one's called the discovery question. And this is answering what are we talking about? Open-ended questions, introducing a new topic, seeking to gather facts. So like if you're going through a scripture passage, like so let's say you're going through Jesus on the cross, so a possibility for one of the questions, you read the passage and you can ask them like, what do you guys think is really going on here? And it's kind of an open-ended, figuring out what's going on in the story. The second type of question is called an understanding question. It asks why. It's a more narrow question, seeking to find the relevance and relationships of those facts that we found from the what kind of question. So what's going on in the story? And now you can ask the next question of like, why? Like, why did Jesus wear a crown of thorns? And you can ask that question. You can start getting into some of the symbolism. Maybe some of the kids will know the answer. Like, let's say you have the answer to that question, right? All the symbolism of why Jesus had a crown of thorns, but ask them the question, see if they know. And then the third kind of question is an application question. This answers how. It's a final question challenging the participants to make these facts relevant in their own lives. So like, how does the crown of thorns, what does that mean for you? You can get into things of humility and all those kinds of things. So with all of these questions, it doesn't have to be exactly 3 questions. You can have a bunch of what questions. You can have a bunch of why questions. You can have a couple of how questions. But our role as like the person at the front of the room that starts the beach ball is we are going to launch the question. We're going to ask the question and then just sit, which can get really awkward, right? A lot of times kids don't want to talk. They don't want to respond immediately. If a lot of times what happens is we ask questions and then there's that awkward silence. And then we start to answer our own question, right? All that is teaching young people to do is that if they just be quiet for 4 seconds, they never have to answer a question ever. Like that's, you're training them to be able to get what they want, right? Not to be able to open it up and that sort of thing. So launching the question, if you have thought about these questions and formed them beforehand, one of the other traps we can fall into is not preparing questions. And then you're stuttering. What do you think that Jesus, when he, with the crown and the, what do you think? Like, that's not a question, right? Like, obviously unprepared, very difficult to answer. So, but if you have prepared these questions and you can ask them confidently, you can sit in that awkward silence and invite the awkward silence. And yes, it might be awkward for a while, but somebody's going to say something. As long as you're not the first person to break, somebody will say something. So launch the question and then guide the question. You don't have to give the answer yet, but kind of guiding the question. Like if somebody starts answering and maybe they're kind of on the right track, but they're not quite, like, oh, that's interesting. Like maybe that's close. Like, I don't know, anybody else, what do you think? Guiding the question. And that also comes into the just kind of the managing of the session, right? You know, that's if somebody's veering off and you're talking about the crown of thorns, and then 2 people are talking about the crown of thorns, and the third people start talking about football, and then the 4th person starts talking about their dog. It's like guide the conversation back to the question, the original question that was posed. And then finally, when you think like the conversation has kind of died down, like you can summarize. And at that point, that's your chance to be like, okay, maybe the kids didn't quite get all of like our objective from the beginning, right? Maybe they didn't, the objective that involved the crown of thorns, if that was the case, they didn't quite get it. You can summarize what they said, insert the most important thing here, and then you ask the next question. And what do you do there? You ask the question, guide the conversation, and you can summarize, right? And remember the beach ball thing, because I think the temptation is like, you wouldn't be here if you weren't excited about your faith, right? So the temptation is, I ask the question, and then, one kid says something and I get really excited about what they said, and I'm popping right back in, right? What that's training is that this conversation is going to be me, one person, me, another person, me, another person, me, another person, instead of a conversation between all of us, right? Let's just say you have a group of 10 kids, 20 kids, whatever it is. You want them to be able to have that conversation together. Now, obviously, like a lot of this in my mind is that like fifth grade to 12th grade. With little kids, like I know, because we do some family catechesis, where like my family with my kids meets with 2 other families that have similar age kids, and it's not the most in-depth conversation, right? But we can use this same kind of method, right? Where we can read a scripture story, or we can, like last week we did the Immaculate Conception, where it was the same kind of idea. There are these primary themes that we wanted to hit in the Immaculate Conception, like for the younger kids, like whose conception was the Immaculate Conception, right? Which could be a thing that people get confused, and asking them. And then, what does the Immaculate Conception mean? Like, why did the Immaculate Conception have to happen? And maybe they don't know. Like, my 8-year-old was starting to get close to an answer. You can still use this method, but just apply it to whatever age group you're going to have, right? The discussion portion of our sessions, like with our kids, is maybe 5 to 8 minutes. With junior high and high school kids, we can get into 30 minutes, right? So take these principles, apply it to whatever age group that you are working with. Okay. Now, writing these questions, it once again all comes back to what is the objective that you have for the session that you are having that day. Writing that, and you kind of know what you want to teach. So matching those questions up with what you're teaching that day. And if you write a question, you realize like this question actually doesn't help me reach the objectives that I'm trying to get to today, rewrite a question, add a new question and that sort of thing. So, okay, so going back to how God has worked with his people, myself, you, the Old Testament, New Testament. As I was saying earlier, he reveals something and then invites a response. So there's a bunch of different ways that we can respond. One way is, God reveals himself and we want to respond in praise and thanksgiving. So like the Mass and prayer and those sorts of things, right? Another primary way is like, how are we going to make this apply to our lives? And then the other way is like, knowing what God teaches. So like just being able to comprehend things and understand things. So one thing that I know that the stats are crazy for how many kids are leaving, with it, the faith in their young 20s. And it's interesting, some of the stats that have come out, that it's not like a lot of times kids can hear you teach about tenets of the faith, but they've never put it into their own words. So even if they're like, if you explain the Immaculate Conception and they're able to explain it back, like obviously you don't want them like speaking fully wrong things, like heretical things, but if maybe your answer was perfect and their answer is about 90%, that's better for them than your 100% correct answer. And here's why I say that. That might seem odd, but the reason that I say that is a lot of kids can sit in Mass, can sit in your sessions and understand what you're saying, but never be able to articulate it if they've never been given a chance to. And then they go off to college, and then somebody challenges them on something about their faith, and they're like, "Well, I heard so and so teach me about that a few years ago in our CCE program, but I'm not really sure how to say it for myself." Right. So that's one of the things that we can be able to do in our sessions is, God is revealing things through you, the teacher, the facilitator of these things. You've taken things that the church teaches, that Jesus has taught, and we're presenting them to the young people. But we need to give them, if we are giving them the content, we need to give them a chance to respond. Like the first one, obviously respond in prayer, right? There should be some type of prayer happening. I'm sure all of you are doing that, but some type of prayer in your sessions, responding to God for what we've learned today in Thanksgiving. The second is like, how does this apply to my life, right? Because we have all these things that we've learned. Like, I have knowledge about, the examples we've used today. I have knowledge about the crown of thorns. I have knowledge about the Immaculate Conception. I have knowledge about who Jesus is. But if I never connect that to how I'm going to live my life today, then I'm not really being able to respond, right? That's why we have the important, that's what the importance of those how questions, of how, like asking them, how is this going to apply to your life? Because they can hear a thing about the Immaculate Conception and be like, hey, that's happened 2,000 years ago to a young woman in the Middle East. That has nothing to do with me, right? Like that could be a thing that they can think, but it's like, no, but like go through the story and all the themes that have popped up throughout the session. How does that apply to your life? And then giving them a chance to articulate it. That's one of the most important things in these questions, in these what questions, these how questions, these why questions, for them having a chance to articulate their faith, what they think that they are hearing from you in a place that's safe, right? Where they're safe at church, and also they have somebody that if they say something incorrectly, they can be, corrected, right? so that they don't get to a place later on in life where they're in college or working or whatever, and they get challenged on and they can't articulate it. So a couple of bullet points to remember, the things that I've mentioned, but I just want to make sure that I got all of this. Write good questions. Launch those questions. Do those questions help you attain your objective? Don't try to answer your own questions. Remember the beach ball. Don't, because if you answer your own questions, they're never going to answer any. The summarization time, it's not a teaching time per se. It could be used as that. Summarize what they said, correct anything that needs to be corrected. So yeah, any questions? I've threw a lot at you. At this point, are there any questions? You can just unmute and pop on.
I have a question about when kids get to the high school level, and it almost seems like they experience Sunday school burnout. I don't even know how else to describe that. You get to like 10th grade and they've been in Sunday school since preschool, and I don't know, we kind of lose them when it comes to like, this should be like the ideal time for discussion questions and really like pushing that forward. But even then, like for me, I feel like I'm pulling teeth sometimes with even discussion questions we put out. So and that's how I set up my class. I have the objective, here's a lesson, we throw in videos, we have discussion questions, but even then it almost seems like there's a fear of answering incorrectly. And so therefore there is no answer given. And so what do you recommend in, I guess, that regard? Like, where do you go from there?
Sure. Yeah. And you can take this answer with a grain of salt, because like you guys know the content that you have to hit. But one thing that we've done when we start getting into 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, one of the easiest ways that I have found to help their engagement is to ask them what they want to be covering, right? That might not be the most kosher thing with, the content you have to get to or that sort of thing. But as they're getting older, for me, it starts to become a catch-all. Like, what did you miss in the other 10 grades before this? Like, so one thing that we have done is ask them at the beginning of the year, like, what are the things that are like holding you back from really being in love with faith or really being in love with the church? And like, we've gotten things that can be some hot button issues. So like, it's like, I like everything that I've heard, but I'm not sure I like the Catholic Church because the church is teaching on abortion or gay marriage or that sort of thing, right? Like, if those are the things that are on their mind, if they're even like, I've heard all this, but I'm not even sure that God exists, or I'm not sure that God really hears me. I got muted. We okay?
Yeah, we're good. We're good. Yeah. If
Okay,
everyone
cool.
just make sure you're muted if you're not asking a question.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay.
Gotcha.
Go ahead.
I was in trouble.
No, you're good. You're good. You're good.
What was I saying? So then you can still build. So essentially what we did is at the first two sessions, we would build together a list of questions or topics that they have, right? And those were the topics that we would go throughout the semester, right? And a lot of times you can even match that list up with the things that you need to be teaching. So that's one thing that we've done. I'm trying to remember all the things that you said. So like getting them to talk, I think one of the things, maybe you've done this, maybe you haven't, but that embracing of the awkward silence, it's more awkward for them than it is for you. As awkward as it is for us as the adults, like they don't want the silence. I think some more like minutiae kinds of things is like even presenting to them like, hey, you're in 10th grade now. We want this to be more of a discussion thing than a teaching thing. Because, like we want you talking more. It's like even just being upfront and honest with them about that, those things might help as well. So I can't see who asked the question, but does any of that help? Do you have follow-up questions from that question before we move on to something else?
Yeah, no, that helps. I think even with hot button topics, even like, so we do that the first day of class. I have them, send in and like
Oh,
anonymously
great.
send in
Sure.
like what their topics are. But even then, I can't say it. It depends on the year, it depends on the group of students too, on how that goes.
Sure.
But yeah, I think the embracing the awkward silence is just something I need to do. So,
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah, you
thank you
said
so
something.
much.
Yeah, you said something else there that reminded me of something else I was going to say earlier. One of the things there too is I had I had a group of kids that I have had in a small group since they were in 6th grade. So I've walked through with this exact same group of boys from 6th grade, and they're seniors now. And that group has changed a lot. And like I have had to change a lot as they've gone through, right? Like in 6th grade, if we met for let's say we met for an hour, like we would play a game for 15-20 minutes to kind of get them energized, and they're talking. Then it's like it's one of those things like it's harder for them, and they know too that like if they're talking and being rambunctious and having fun with the 10 of there's about 10 of us, it's really weird for you to go to all having a blast to nobody talking at all, right? So usually it kind of helps them to open up. But as they've gotten older, like one thing that I realized with you guys specifically about 10th graders, when they got into 10th and 11th grade, it became less like I was teaching less and less. We were talking more about life stuff, and faith and church teaching and those things would pop up. But like I would get there, and before, if we were going to meet for an hour when they were in 10th grade, we would quote unquote plan 20-25 minutes of catching up. What's been going on in your day, in your week? What's going on? Like, how are things at school? How are things at home? Like, I was at your basketball game the other day. Like, I saw you get dunked on. Like, that was hilarious. Like talking to them about all these things. And then a lot of times as those discussions were happening, maybe my goal for the day would change. Like if a kid had a breakup, we started just having a conversation about how to survive, have healthy breakups, how to keep moving after breakups, like those sorts of things. And like we were having conversations about what was going on in their life in a Catholic context, and with like scriptures would pop into my mind, church teachings would pop into my mind, and I'd be reminding them of these things. But as they got older, it became more of the meshing of like the teachings of the church and their lives, and trying to merge those two things together. Because I think one of the reasons that a lot of people that age start to tune out is like, oh, I've heard this before. We've all done it too. Like as you get older, it's like, oh, I've heard this homily before. I've heard this teaching before. I've heard this before. So you start to tune out. And I think the question that I have to ask myself, and the question that I pose to them, is like, yeah, this is the 87th time you've heard about honoring the Sabbath, but how have you been recently on honoring the Sabbath, right? Because and you can insert whatever your group is going through, right? Whether it's, oh yeah, you've been told not to cuss, right? But you glaze your eyes over because you've been told over and over again. But I heard you yesterday at your football game, like those sorts of things. So like being able to take, they've heard it before. So as they're getting older, meshing it more to all the stuff that you already know. How can we make it cohesive and applying in your life? So that was the other thing that I was thinking of when you asked.
Taylor, there was a question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
At what age should you really start asking questions about how it's, that especially apply more to life? And, I guess where do you really begin?
Yeah, sure. So like with elementary, I think you can start doing it with those elementary kids, right? So like in my house, I have an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old. So like especially, I would say around that like 5 or 6. So like all the grades that y'all are teaching, like for those, this would be more specifically for those of you guys teaching that elementary age, is this is as a parent, so I'm gonna use a parent example, but I'm sure things happen with you guys. But it's my 8-year-old and my 6-year-old are fighting, and they're just going at it all the time, you know, bickering and all of these sorts of things. And then my son either yells at her or something, right? And then I take him over to his room, he goes to timeout, and then I go in and I talk to him. I'm like, why are you treating your sister like that? You know, I can ask these guys, why are you treating your sister like that? And he usually doesn't say anything because he's, you know, upset or whatever. But then I'm like, you know that like you need to love her. And like, even if she's doing things to bother you, you still, you're the older one. You need to, you know, show her love. And, you know, you were in the wrong, you need to go say sorry, right? So now, like, that's a pretty typical parenting thing, right? But like, we've showed like love, you need to go love them and like apply all, you know, the things that you've heard at church, the things that we've taught you as your parent. You need to be loving and not act like that in the first place. And since you have acted like that, you need to go say sorry, right? That's a parenting example. But in the classroom, if you're talking about, like, a lot of times it's like the Old Testament stories, right? Where it's like Cain and Abel, right? You're talking about Cain and Abel, you're going to have a very similar conversation about that I had with my son, right? It's like, oh, Cain and Abel, asking elementary kids, like, oh, do you and your siblings ever fight? What does that look like? What are you guys fighting about? And they're like, oh, he took my toy. You know, you can be kind of silly, you know, or with those younger kids. But it's like, well, how should you respond when your sister steals your toy? How should you respond when your brother yells at you? How should you respond? So you're getting into those how questions at an age appropriate level. You're not going to have a 30-minute conversation like you would if you're asking that question, you know, the 10th graders, right? But you can ask those how questions. A lot of those young kids, like my kids, blow me away constantly about like, oh, like you can do more than I think you can when it comes to comprehending things. So I like that person's name is Pretty. That's awesome. Any other questions? Challenges, thoughts? How are you going to apply this to your situation? Because I know that we're talking to a bunch of different situations.
Yeah, I just had a thought. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very helpful and insightful. But I think there's always the challenge to balance the need to truly discuss the faith concerns and issues and the hot button topics with the need to cover, you know, material. You want to be able to, there's pressure to cover these things and make sure the kids are prepared. There are expectations from, you know, like the diocesan level or whatever.
Sure.
And so I know that we have to balance it and kind of, you know, spend quality time on these issues. But I was just making a comment that it is a challenge.
Sure.
And I also your comment about the embracing the awkward silence. You know, the thought in my mind was, well, how long do we wait? Like, is it 5 minutes, 10 minutes when we finally break out? I was tempted to kind of ask because I have been in those and I have done exactly what you said not to do, kind of filled in because, you know, you have to say something or, you know, or the kids, we're going to lose the kids, you know, that kind of thought. So they were the two things.
Sure. So diocesan stuff and then the awkward silence. Okay. Don't let me forget. So the awkward silence, practically 30 to 45 minutes. Sorry, I'm so sorry. 30 to 45 seconds. 30 to 45 seconds. That's what I meant to say.
Okay, all right.
30 to 45 seconds feels like an eternity in that situation, right? And that's pretty typically like what I use as like my max. Like I'm not sitting with a stopwatch, but I can, you know, 30 to 45 seconds. And at that point, I'm still not giving them an out. I might rephrase my question, but I'm not moving on. And they'll get it. They'll understand. Like, hey, we're gonna do this. You know, so that would be like practically numbers wise, 30 to 45 seconds. But like that might seem maybe a picture in your head if this is something that's new to you or been a challenge to you before. it's not going to be in my experience, it's not going to be every question like that. It's going to take maybe a session, 2 sessions, 3 sessions, 4 sessions to start to break the ice. But once they are kind of like quote unquote trained to know that you're not going to back down from the questions and you're not going to back down from the awkward silence, the goal is that the hope is that they will start answering a little bit more and it'll be a little bit more comfortable. And that they know, because like one thing for them, I know that a lot of times this is hard for teachers and it's hard for kids, because all we ever received, like us now, a lot of what we received as kids was all lecture, right? And a lot of what these kids have received is all lecture. So you ask a question and a lot of times they're just shocked. Like, what? I thought this was your job, So like a lot of times it is just kind of reframing and letting them become comfortable with however you're going to incorporate this, right? However and I think we can get into that with the diocesan thing, but when it comes to diocesan stuff, kind of get into the nitty gritty of that. 2 methods that I've used before in incorporating these questions and still doing like what was required of me as the youth minister from, what my pastor said, they're, coming from the diocese. 2 things. One, I would do, depending on what you have. So if you have an hour, typically what I would do would be option A would be like a 30-minute me talking and covering all the things the diocese says I need to cover, covering all the things they need to make sure that they have a comprehensive understanding of the faith. And then 30 minutes of what do you guys think? How does this apply to your life? Kind of diving into those things, right? The other thing, option B would be, in a perfect world, you have 4 things that you need to cover. If you have that hour, you talk for about 5-10 minutes. Like I'm thinking in option A, a lot of times it is like me standing in front of the classroom or in front of the youth group or whoever it is, giving a talk, and then they split off into groups where you can have a discussion. 8 to 10 is ideal, right? The other option is if you're somebody who is in a classroom with a group about that size, 8, 10, 12, whatever it is doing the whole session where I'm sitting in a circle with everybody, desks. Like you all know, it's hard for me to talk specifically, but I'm picturing like all of us surrounded in a circle, and I talk and kind of preach for about 5-10 minutes with, like, let's say the diocese has 4 things that I need to accomplish this day. 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes here, 5 to 10 minutes in discussion here, 5 to 10 minutes here of point 2, discussion, 5 to 10 minutes here of point 3, discussion, 5 to 10 minutes, point 4, discussion. Now, in either of those options, let's say the diocese says you need to cover these 4 things a day. Well, the discussion went a good but different place. I'm not talking about it didn't go to the TikTok or the football thing. Like it went to a place where it needed to go. But I only covered 2 of what the diocese said I need to cover, right? Well, the other option is move that to the next session, right? And I did this when I was a youth minister, where it's like I would get behind, right? And I would have to change something, change your plan for the semester. It's like, okay, like things happen, right? So I hope that's helpful for your question. Is like you can still incorporate these questions, these discussions, and still be able to cover all of what like you're being told that you need to cover. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
Taylor, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, when we used guided discussion, what is the recommended number of students per teacher? Because the discussion is more challenging when we have 40 or so students, and it is the case, Taylor. I can just say that some of our classrooms, you do have large numbers, so especially when
Sure.
those numbers are just large, how do you go about like this method?
Sure. Yeah. So if you aren't like the ideal group, I think for a small group discussion would be like 8 to 10. But you can use these same principles in a group with 40 people. So like imagine like all of the any movie that you've ever seen about a good teacher, like there's a bunch of them, like they're using a lot of asking questions and there's back and forth, right? So I think the method, the second method that I mentioned a second ago in the previous question about teaching for 5 to 10 minutes and then asking questions and then teaching for 5 to 10 minutes, asking questions, I think you can do that in a group of 40. So if you're standing in front of a classroom with 40 people in it, you can teach, point one that you need to cover for that day, that whoever is telling you that you need to do this, right? You can do your prepared teaching for point one, and then you can, these same questions that we've been talking about this whole time, the discovery question that asks why, the understanding question that, the discovery question that asks what, the understanding question that asks why, and the application that asks how. You can still ask those types of questions for bullet point one that you need to cover. Ask those three questions, three-ish questions or so, and then move on to the next bullet point, right? And yeah, so I think you can still do it. Like, is it more difficult? Yes. Like, if we're being honest, like, it is a little bit more difficult with those larger numbers. But that's why y'all are here. Y'all are the new teachers to help keep those numbers down. That's so they get into smaller groups, but you can still do it. It is a little bit more difficult, but you can, all of these things that you've been doing, that I've been imagining of you sitting in a circle, if you're standing in front of the classroom of 40 people, you can still ask those questions, embrace the awkward silence. Somebody will answer, wait for the next person to answer. Like, let's say I'm leading this thing, and then Father, when he was 12 years old, answers the first question. I might say very good or good, but that's all I'm going to say, because I want somebody else to talk, and I'll just stand there and kind of look around. And then somebody else pipes up, So all the things that we've been talking about, you can do with those larger groups. You're just facilitating that group discussion from the front. I see another question here from Lindsay. Our CCD classes run for almost an hour and a half. Teaching elementary students and having the full attention for that long is usually very challenging. Yes. Do you have any helpful suggestions that we can incorporate in our teaching lessons besides going through the chapters, asking questions? Yeah. So with elementary, like, a lot of times it's we talked about with like response things, right? The things are revealed to us, and we God wants us to respond. We respond in prayer. So do some kind of prayer activity with them. You respond. Like, I think a lot with little kids. Like, the first one that pops into my head is like one time when I was a kid. I think I've seen my kids do it at the Catholic school. It's like, what they would do is they would talk about prayer, and then they would make a rosary, like a little paper rosary, right? Yeah, I'm sure you've seen these. Like, cut pieces of paper, tape them together, make them into links and that sort of thing. The Our Fathers are red, the Hail Marys are gray, and then you make like a decade of the rosary, or make a whole rosary, like depending on how many kids you have, obviously, right? But let's say you make a decade of the rosary, and then you pray that rosary together, right? If you're teaching them the Hail, with little kids, teaching them the Hail Mary, maybe they already know it. Pray the Hail Mary. Each kid gets to lead a Hail Mary, and then an Our Father. So there you have like your teaching. You have some application. You got to kind of break up their attention span. They got to do something different. Do a craft or whatever, and then pray together, right? So there's a lot of different things you do. Like one of the big things that I love to do, even with high school students, and obviously you can do this with little kids, is like to play a game that may or may not have something to do with the lesson that you're trying to do. Like, there's one game that I play that's called Is It Really in the Bible? It's popping up slides, and it's like a random quote, and it's either the Bible or like Shakespeare or a famous movie or something, and they have to guess, is this in the Bible or is it in the movie? And then you can connect that to, well, now we're going to talk about a scripture passage, or the importance of knowing scripture, or something like that, right? So like, that's an example that you can do. But yeah, I think a lot of those things, like, sometimes people can think like, oh, maybe that was wasted time that we could have been teaching. Like you said it yourself, like, elementary school kids aren't going to be able to listen to you for an hour and a half. They're just not. They're not going to be able to have discussions for an hour and a half. So I think being able to have all these things at your disposal, your prepared content, activities, games, the discussion question, and like, you could even like rotate through those things. If you have an hour and a half with elementary kids, you could do like a talk, like a teaching portion, ask them a couple of questions, move into like the activity, and then maybe do it all again, do another teaching portion and another prayer activity, that sort of thing. So just to kind of break up the attention span thing. So so yeah, I know like my kids do a lot of like arts and crafts. So like they'll Immaculate Conception's on my mind because it was just a few days ago. Like my kids were like taught in class about what it was, but then they also did like, they probably spent 20 minutes coloring a coloring page that was Mary, a picture of Mary at the Immaculate, or a picture of Mary with Anna and Joachim, right? And then they brought it home to me, and like that's what made they brought it home to me, and they were so happy to show it to me, and they were like, "Hey, look, I made this picture." I was like, "Oh, what is it about?" And they were like, "Oh, it's Mary and her parents." It's like they learned something, and like that coloring page helped make it sticky, like it stuck for them, right? If you just tell kids like, "Oh, Mary's parents are Anna and Joachim," they'll most likely forget, right? But if they spend 20 minutes coloring a page with both of them, they might remember. So there's those things that may or may not seem like wastes of time, like coloring pages, might actually be helpful in making those things sticky. Elizabeth asks, "Oh, you're welcome. I was just wondering." It's like, oh, I didn't ask if I answered her question, but there you go. Elizabeth asks, in the larger groups, it's often just a few students participate in the discussion. Do you have any tips to encourage more students participate? Yes, I do. So both during the discussion and after, like as you get to know your group, or if you already know your group, like like you seem to here, during, like I'm an extrovert. I'm the type of person that would love to either raise my hand or not raise my hand and just blurt out something into, if we're having a discussion. So if it's specifically asking, if I ask a question, I might specifically ask somebody that I know is an introvert. So let's say I ask a question of something that we used earlier. So like, what symbolism do you think that the crown of thorns had in the Passion? Like, what do you think, Elizabeth? Like, name a person that you think might know the answer. Like, you don't want to shame people, like people who like don't want to talk. Like, obviously, you don't want to make them feel bad, but it's like somebody who might not be the first to answer, but might give an answer. You can ask specifically. And like I have like that guys group that I had earlier. Like, if I just let the conversation run, 2 guys would talk the whole time, like me and like 2 of the high school students, right? But if I start to ask, like, "Oh, hey, Gabe, like, what do you think about this?" And Gabe might have an off the wall answer, but he wasn't going to be the first to answer. So that's like a during thing, is like you can start specifically asking names of people, or like if you have a very large group, like, "Oh, we've been getting a lot of answers from this side of the room. What about this side of the room?" And embrace the awkward silence, right? So whether it's specific names or sides of the room or those sorts of things. Now, not during the conversation, like if it's really a problem and it's like the same 2 or 3 people, I think there's 2 kinds of people that answer all the time. One, the person who's trying to be like annoying or the class clown or that sort of thing, right? The other person is someone who is genuinely excited about the things that you were talking about and genuinely wants to talk about them, right? I think if this constantly is happening over and over again, you could have conversations with both of those people. Like, "Hey, before you leave, Taylor, can I talk to you real quick?" And if I'm the kid that's just being boisterous and obnoxious, which I got pulled aside for this multiple times when I was that age, of like, "Hey, like, I love your energy. It is getting a little bit distracting. Would you mind, trying to stay focused on the conversation we're having?" If it's the second kind of person, like somebody who is like the holiest person in your thing, and they come from a great family and they know all the answers, you can go up to them and be like, "Hey, I know that you know all the answers. I love that you're so excited to give these answers. There's a lot of your classmates that don't know all the answers. We want to give them a chance to answer. Would you be okay if we did that next week?" Both of those conversations go well 99% of the time. So you can do things both during and kind of after the session to help that.
Taylor, one of the questions we often get is, what's the appropriate age to have discussions related to hot button topics, like gay marriage or abortion or things like that?
Sure. Yeah, that is that can be interesting, right? I'm going to give my answer with the caveat up front. Ask your pastor because I don't want to be the reason you get upset with your pastor, right? So like I had a pastor one time, as crazy as this sounds, that that told me that I couldn't talk about anything sexual related, even with the high school kids. Like we couldn't give the chastity talk, we couldn't give the don't watch porn talk with high school kids. And it's like, you kind of have to, right? So like with hot button things, I think now with how prevalent it is, it's asking the question of like, have your students heard about this, or are they about to hear about this? Kids are watching porn at 5th and 6th grade. Do you really want the church to not have a say in that, right? Now this can get hot button things, whether it's porn or gay marriage or whatever, right? Parents can get upset too, right? So you have to keep that in mind. But if kids are watching porn at 5th and 6th grade, and the first time that they're going to hear anything about it from the church is in 10th grade, they're already addicted, right? If they're hearing about transsexual stuff and gay, lesbian, those sorts of things, they have in junior high, they have siblings and friends and stuff that are going through that. So they have heard about it from quote unquote the world. Like if they're starting to hear those things, like the church needs to have a say in that. So like the hot button topics are a hot button issue on how to address them in the church, because you have to keep in all these things. How does your pastor want you to address it? Obviously you don't want to get fired or all these sorts of things. But I think having those conversations, especially, I think right when they're getting into junior high, there needs to be some kind of conversation with pastor, youth minister. If you're not on staff, you're a volunteer. Like, how do we need to address this? Because one, it's going to come up, and two, even if it doesn't come up, like as awkward as it is, and how difficult those conversations can be, if they hear about it from the world for 4 years before they hear it from the church, they've probably already made up their mind. It's going to be harder to convince them otherwise. So very sticky subject, but yeah. Any other questions?
I actually have a question that's sort of like a follow-up question to that. So I'm teaching 4th graders, so I'm sort of at like that elementary school end. And I don't know if you kind of already answered this, but I was wondering how you would recommend like bringing up those hot button issues with the younger kids, because obviously there's like the concern of like how much we should be censoring it so it's not like they're like leaving the class crying, because like we don't want to do that. But also it's like what you said, because it definitely needs to be like brought up at some point. So I was just curious if you have like any input on that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think yeah, because that has happened too. Like, yeah, the other pendulum swing of like you bring up, like this has happened before, where you bring up porn because you know that some 5th graders have heard about it and are watching it, but the other 5th graders have never heard about it before, and now they're intrigued, right? It's like obviously you don't. It's a difficult thing to do. One thing I didn't say that I thought about after I'm glad you asked the clarifying question is if it's like one specific kid. I think this comes up a lot with a divorce, right? Where a lot of kids don't know the church is teaching on divorce, they're little kids, but like if you know that parents are going through a divorce, asking to talk with one of the parents or both of the parents with that kid and be like, how can we address this? If you find out that one kid, their sibling is gay or they've been watching porn or that sort of thing, like you can do that one-on-one with the, like not one-on-one, but like with the kid and a parent. It's like inviting the parents into that conversation might be a good thing. Like when they come to pick them up or that sort of thing, if you can have that conversation, if they're coming in, like, hey, can you step in here real quick and have that conversation there too? Like, hey, this came up during our session today. I just kind of wanted to make sure that you knew about it and kind of have a little conversation about it. You can do those sorts of things, but that one's hard. That all of these hot button issues are hard to nail down like a hard and fast rule. Like, this is what you need to do when. A lot of it is discernment, like your discernment with your pastor or a youth minister, whoever's like, the staff member in charge. There's a lot of discernment that goes in. So like, you probably don't want to just dive into it, right? But if it comes up, like one thing that I've done, like if let's just say porn comes up in a discussion, and you're not sure what to do, you can always just say like, hey, we'll talk about that next week, right? And kind of get back on topic to what you were talking about. And then you can have, that gives you some availability to ask the pastor, ask the youth minister, maybe ask the parents before you address it with everybody else. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. It's hard. All of that stuff is very difficult on when to do. Just, yeah, that discernment is always good. Pretty is back. As a catechist, what can we do to bring back our youngsters to faith? How can we avoid turning them away from our faith? Yeah, big, weighted question. I think one of the things to think about is like why people are leaving the church. All of the, I referenced earlier, like a lot of the studies of people who are saying that they're no longer involved in faith, or they're no longer affiliated with faith. A lot of times it's not like, oh, I disagree with what the church teaches anymore. It's that they just drifted away because it wasn't something that was important to them. So a lot of times it wasn't a knowledge thing, right? It wasn't like, oh, I know the church teaches this, and it was something else. It was that they never got the chance to voice some of these things, to have conversations, real conversations about these things. So if that is the case, obviously that's not true for every person in every circumstance. But if you have kids that have fallen away from the faith, I'm going to say things that you probably already know. But one, the most important thing to do is pray for them. We've all heard the St. Monica story. One of the coolest ministries I've gotten to be involved in is there's this thing at our parish called St. Monica's Army, and it's a group of parents whose kids have walked away from faith, and they get together once a month to be encouraged by the leader of it. He does the same kind of thing. He'll give a little message, and then they sit in. Here we do it in adoration, and everybody praise and adoration together, and it's just kind of a community thing, right? Secondly, in having conversations with, whether it's your kids, like your biological kids, or kids from your youth group, like one of the things that you can do is sit down and call them up. If I'm assuming that these kids who have gone away from the faith are a little bit older, ask them to go have a bite to eat. I invited a kid who had been to the youth group. He had just turned 18. I asked permission, like, hey, I asked his mom, hey, do you mind if we go eat at McDonald's together? I bought him $20 worth of McDonald's because that's what he ordered. I told him I was paying, and apparently that was the mistake I made. But we sat there with McDonald's. He was an atheist. He was identified as bisexual. Was in a relationship. He was 18. He was in a relationship with a guy that was like 26. And like, I think we sat down and just ate a meal, and I just let him kind of share his stuff. I would ask questions. I would ask him what was going on. But coming in to being able to have a conversation with somebody about what's going on in their life, and then being able to kind of speak the truth as that conversation goes, works better than like trying to force it on them, or trying to have the conversation of like, that what you're doing is wrong and you can't be doing that anymore. Like, while that is true, it probably won't go over as well. So that gets to the how can we avoid turning them away from the faith. I think one of the questions that I ask myself a lot is like, what is the experience that people are having in the Catholic Church with what I'm doing, right? Like, if all I'm doing is teach, like, I'm using examples that we've already talked about, but if all I'm doing is teaching at them, that's what church is for them. And that's nobody really wants to go to somewhere where all they're doing is teaching at, being taught at, right? That's not even what the church says. the church says that the Mass is supposed to is the work of the people. Like we're all supposed to be actively participating in the Mass, right? When it comes to, like a lot of kids just leave because it's boring, right? So if you're not the most engaging person, it doesn't mean you have to change and be super bubbly all the time, right? But it's how can we get the kids to be more engaged by asking the questions, playing some games, having discussions that are just about their life. Like those types of things will start to help that. Like obviously it's not a bulletproof plan, right? But those things can tend to help. I hope that helps.
Taylor, one of the other issues that I heard from teachers is that, teaching means like a lot of intellectual stimulations, teaching, give them knowledge, but how do you involve them in prayer life? How do you have them come to Holy Mass? How do you have their spirituality goes up, by all of this teaching? Is there any tips that you can provide in terms of how do we incorporate that into the teaching?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I've started to do, especially like at retreats, but you can do it at your regular sessions as well, is one of my favorite things about being Catholic is that there are so many different ways to pray. There are so many different options on how to pray. And one, that's beautiful, but two, it's good for people who don't really connect with one sort of prayer. Don't crucify me for this. I'm just going to say it though. I've tried praying the rosary. I prayed it just about every day for like 2 or 3 years. It's not the type of prayer that makes me feel close to God, that makes me feel like I'm growing in my holiness, right? It does for other people, right? But types of prayers for me that have helped, like Lectio Divina, praying with scripture, adoration, mass, like those types of prayers really help me connect to God, right? So you talked about like how to engage them in their spiritual life. There are so many different ways that we can be teaching kids to pray, right? Like I know pretty typically at DC, you start with an opening prayer, you close with the closing prayer. But like doing a Lectio Divina, teaching them how to do Lectio Divina, you can also get to a lot of the points that you're trying to cover, right? Like I know that not everything that you need to cover is scriptural based, right? But let's just say it is. Let's just say the thing that you're teaching on that day is the Tower of Babel. Do Lectio Divina with Tower of Babel, either before or after you do the lesson, and that might help with the conversation. Because after you do Lectio Divina, obviously, do this with the older kids, right? But there are so many different ways we have to pray. Lectio, like different memorized prayers that you can teach them. We just worship music, praying with music. A lot of people pray with art, like an icon or something like that, right? Like we can be doing these things in our classroom and modeling these different kinds of prayer. Because like, for example, let's just say the only way that you ever prayed in your session was the rosary, and some kids loved it, but other kids never connected with it, right? But then the hope is if you're doing different types of prayer that are all Catholic, right? Some kids will connect with some and be able to start that spiritual life. And then one thing that I realized, like when I was in college, and I was really involved in my church when I was in junior high and high school, but tell them what your spiritual life looks like. Share what your prayer looks like. Because I realized when I was in college that I heard all of these talks on prayer, and I would even be encouraged to go pray. And then I would sit down to pray, and I'd start in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and I'd be like, I don't know what to do. Like I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. Like I knew that prayer was important, and I knew that I should pray, and I wanted to pray, but I didn't really know how. So like, I think being open as an adult that has influence in their life, like what does your prayer look like, is a very healthy thing to be doing there.
So Taylor, yeah, I think the question that is been posted maybe might take us a little bit out of what we're speaking about, but in connection with that question, I think maybe bringing it to our our classrooms, you know, you've been kind of encouraging us to ask more questions, but I feel like you spoke about how, you know, there was this one kid and maybe you had like, you know, lunch with him at McDonald's, something like that. A lot of times that's not, it's not a reality for, you know, our CCD teachers to be able to really take kids out. You know, we have all the safe environment protocol and,
Right.
you know, you're part-time, you show up on Sunday and you're able to teach. But still at the end of the day, there are some gaps that exist between the teacher and the students. So that can be cultural gaps, that can be age gap. I mean, you know, even you could just have graduated from college. A lot of our new teachers say this to me. You just graduated out of college, but you feel this incredible gap between the students. And so there's some just like differences overall in ways of thinking, and how, knowing all these things, especially knowing that some of these gaps exist, how can you be a better facilitator and be able to ask those right questions, realizing that the bridge is not fully completely there, you know?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's realizing and being honest with what you bring to the table, right? So like age gap wise, one of the most influential people for me in high school, I mentioned earlier my youth minister, who was kind of the young and cool and hip, you know, musician kind of guy. He had a big influence on my life. The other person was a guy who was about 71 years old and had a lot of knowledge about the faith and was really like, that's what he wanted to bring. He had a huge impact on me because he cared about me a lot. And just like, I'm speaking specifically for me, like all four of my grandparents passed away either before I was born or when I was pretty young, right? So he kind of played that grandfathering role for me through my 4 years of high school and, you know, 3 years of junior high. So that's what he brought to the table, was kind of a loving, older, wiser thing. Like the other guy was the fun and hip and engaging, like the guy that I wanted to be like and big inspiration, right? So like everybody brings something different to the table. So I think the question is like, what do you bring? So if it's an age thing, what were the other examples you said? You said age and like cultural. Like don't try to be cool. Like if you're not cool, don't try to be like yo what's up, bro? Like that's not who you are. Like that's not what they need from you, right? They get that from their friends. They get that from older siblings or whatever, right? But what you can be to them is and what you can be to them is an influence on who they are as a young person and who they are in their faith. There's this idea that I mentioned Sticky Faith earlier. There's this organization called Sticky Faith, and one of the biggest things that they are being a proponent of is, like you mentioned, safe environment. It's like, you know, there's so many things that churches, you know, have said that's, you know, the ratio, like you need one adult for whatever, you know, every 8 kids, every 12 kids, like whatever the ratio is for your area. But what they're saying is like for the kids who are staying active in their faith, it's not this like 1 adult to 5 ratio. It's actually the opposite. It's the kids that are staying in their faith have 5 people in their life that are influential in their faith outside of their parents, right? So this could be a CCE teacher. This could be a coach at their school. This could be the older neighbor down the road. This could be an uncle that's really influential. Like there's so many different options for what this could be. But like the goal is to be one of those people, to be somebody in their life that is a role model, that is somebody that they know is a person of faith and a person who deeply cares about their faith. A lot of times it's like that example is what you're giving. So it's really, yeah, just really ultimately coming back around to like being honest with what you bring to the table. You know, you can always try to improve. Like if you know you're not the most exciting person, like, you know, maybe, you know, like we talked about earlier, crafting these questions to try to help the discussion be engaging. That doesn't mean you have to go from being like an introvert to like bubbly person. Like you can still be who you are and still be an influence in their lives.
I know we have only 7 more minutes left. So I'm going to post the link for to receive the participation certificate. So if you can please complete the survey. So I will post it, but we'll continue the discussion for next couple of minutes, right, Rajiv?
Yeah, sure. If there's any last minute concerns, questions, we can do that. Is there anything more, Taylor, that you wanted to cover or you wanted to mention for us?
I think I started saying it earlier, but one other thing. So like, I think I mentioned it when somebody asked the question, but like being okay with asking questions that aren't faith-based to help get into discussion, right? One, it shows that you care about them, but then it also opens them up to conversation. So if you start the session off, or whether you're starting the session off with it or starting like the conversation part off with it, of like reiterating, asking them what's going on in their lives, how they're doing. One thing that we do a lot, some of you might have heard of it, is like we do 2 roses and a thorn. Like we'll start off the discussion with like, what are 2 great things that happened this week and 1 not so great thing that happened this week, and kind of have those conversations. And then you can just kind of naturally move into after you ask the like, how are you doing, you can start asking the questions that you want to get into that are involved with the lesson for the day. But a lot of times that too will help with having them being opened up to questions, because they were just talking about themselves, which is everybody's favorite thing to talk about. And it kind of got them opened up to talking. So yeah, other than that, I'm good unless anybody else has any other questions.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I have noticed that, in the church, kids are very distracted. They do their own things. They're talking to each other, doing some other business, under the chair. They're so distracted. And I oftentimes, feel very difficult to take care of those situations. I talk to them in the class, but I see all the kids are very distracted. They don't know the importance. I think the whole idea of the Sunday school thing is to really bring them closer towards the church, being more active in the class, in the church participation, and those kind of things. But I don't see that effect. I'm a 7th grade teacher, but this first year for me. But I'm thinking, oh my God! And after all these 6 years, they haven't learned really how to behave inside the church, and I feel like we're lacking something major. When am I going to teach these kids now? They're in 7th grade. My 10th grade, my own son in 11th grade, he's even distracted too. So I feel like we are, we teach them all these things, but this is something we are missing something. I don't know how these kids are going to grow up in the future, how much they're going to be. I pray for them, but that's, I don't know what more we can do. I mean, how, I think I have to add, I showed them a little movie in my class one day. It's called The Veil Removed. It's like a 7-minute little short film. It shows what happens during the Holy Mass.
Oh, cool.
And over time, I referred that to the kids. Like, you remember when the angel comes down, angels comes down, the heaven comes down, and the saints are there, it's something like that in a bigger version to explain these kids what happens during the Holy Mass. I think it's very important to make them, keep them attentive, during this Mass. I like your thoughts on it, if you have any idea.
Yeah, for sure. So a few things. First of all, like kids being distracted in Mass is very natural. It happens everywhere. It's happened since the dawn of the Mass. It is something that, but as they're getting older, like you're saying, in the 7th grade and 11th grade, as you were mentioning, like obviously you want them to, like that's the time where it's starting to, 7th grade into 11th grade, it's time to start being a little bit more reverent and a little bit more respectful and those sorts of things, and participating. So one thing, like I think the showing the veil removed thing that you said is perfect. And one, there's a lot of things in the arsenal that you can use, and I think but the first thing that popped in my head is they've been told what they should be doing in church. They've been told, if they're in 7th and 11th grade, they've been told over and over again, sit up straight, don't talk, don't be on your phone, they know that kind of stuff. A lot of the disconnect is, one, it could be just, attention spans are crazy because of these things, right? Like I have trouble paying attention for a whole hour in Mass. I find myself distracted all the time. So some of it's natural, some of it's just discipline on their part. But like you're saying with the veil, the second thing is explaining the why, like which is what this is doing. It's like, why are we doing this, right? So one thing that I've done kind of up front is stuff like that. When they're getting into those older ages of like, why are we being, all the things that you've been told, why should we be quiet in Mass? Why should we not be on our phones in Mass? Why should we be doing those? Because if you just tell them not to do it, they'll probably just get frustrated and do it anyway. The other thing that I found is helpful is like that is part of that why question, but I've done it with groups that I've been like, you know, like when I was the youth minister or whatever, like groups I was responsible for, and saying like part of the why of why we're quiet is because other people are praying, right? Kind of helping them get out of themselves of like, hey, even if you're not super into this today or right now or whatever, like other people are. So like you don't want to be a distraction to them because they're trying to have an encounter with God. And a lot of times that kind of helps too. So kind of like that two-pronged approach of like helping them know the why of it because they know a lot of the what. They know what they're supposed to be doing, but maybe not fully why. But then also, you know, thinking of others, which is a thing that, you know, can be hard for people too, of, you know, even if you're not into it, don't ruin it for the person next to you, that sort of thing.
Cool. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Taylor. I think we're gonna kind of wrap up. I want to also just say, you know, the previous person the question, we're as a diocese, we're hoping to put forward like something like Bishop Barron's series on the Mass for our Curbanas. So hopefully, you know, we'll have more resources like that to come. But just please pray. I mean, it's a lot of work, and currently Kevin Utchin in Houston is working on a project like that. So hopefully that can be a resource. And we will have another session next Saturday, same time. So please try to attend if you can. Taylor, would you mind closing us in prayer? And then I can give a blessing at the end.
Sure. The Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. I thank you for all of these people who have answered your call to share your message with the young people that you have entrusted to them. We ask that as they continue to do so, as they move forward into sharing the faith, that you will equip them with all that they need, both in content and in how you're calling them to share this message. God, we just praise you for your glory. We thank you for the gift of the church and for all of the beauty and richness that it brings. We ask that we are able to share that with all the young people that you have called us to minister to.
May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you always, now, forever, and ever. Amen.
Amen.
God bless you.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I thank everyone for participating in today's session. May God bless you and hope you all have a wonderful weekend. This concludes our session today. All participants may disconnect at this time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Taylor.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor.